Hello, this is Professor Nam-Yong Lee TV. Professor Nam-Yong Lee's column, Long, The Lessons of the Donghak Peasant Revolution, Born in Honam, Will Save the Republic of Korea. The conditions for state collapse in late Joseon, centered on the royal court and entrenched elites, summoned the Donghak peasant revolution of ordinary people. The late 19th century was a turning point. External pressures intensified, while the governing capacity of the central court and local bureaucracy weakened. Orders came down from the centre, yet grievances on the ground were not resolved, responsibility did not rise upward, and fair rules failed to reach the field. When the burdens of taxes and corvée labour concentrated on the common people and administration depended on custom and discretion, corruption increased, trust decreased, and the cooperative fabric of the national community unravelled. I state unequivocally that if we reduce the Donghak revolution to a mere emotional outburst, we lose the lessons needed for national survival. When institutions cannot protect livelihoods or absorb discontent, anger erupts not at individuals but at structures. The moment a state fails to protect its people, the legitimacy of the system collapses. And once legitimacy collapses, society and the nation are pushed into crisis. At that time, Joseon's capacity to solve problems through internal reform had weakened, and the temptation to cover domestic troubles by borrowing the power of foreign forces grew stronger. The more that temptation expands, the fewer choices the state retains, and the greater the justification outsiders gain for intervention. Donghak must be understood as the people's warning to stop that dangerous slide. The uprising of Donghak in Honam was the revolutionary spirit of the common people. In 1894, centered on Gobu and Jeonju in Jeolla province, the Donghak revolution rose in Honam. The people demanded an end to the corrupt structure of rapacious officials and privileged interests, insisting on fair taxation, accountable administration, and institutional channels to resolve injustices. Facing a reality in which survival and dignity were collapsing, they moved with organization and discipline, calling for innovation in national governance and society. We must not consume Honam's Donghak as material for division, we must elevate it as a source of awakening. The fact that the first flames rose in Honam is not a story of one region alone, it is an alarm showing where a nation first reveals its critical breaking point when it begins to fail. Honam's revolutionary spirit should be read not as a call to hate someone, but as a call to cut off ignorance, incompetence, and corruption, and to establish capability and fairness as the standard. The people's demands were simple, yet they shook the very skeleton of the state. When power does not accept responsibility and law and administration fail to protect the weak, vested interests harden and equal opportunity, fair trade and open competition disappear. Then citizens lose trust in government and institutions and the system begins to tremble from within. What the Jeonju Truce and the Jibgangso demonstrated was the power of governance and operations. In 1894, the Jeonju Truce was concluded in Jeonju. It was a choice to halt clashes, restore order, reduce harm, and restart procedures through agreement. If conflict continues, damage to livelihoods grows, administration collapses, and collapse easily becomes a corridor for external intervention. After the Jeonju Truce, Jibgangso offices were established across many areas of Jeolla. The people sought not destruction but the restoration of on-the-ground administration, attempting to curb corruption, handle petitions, and maintain order. Where complaints enter, who processes them, by what standards decisions are made, and what records remain, these become the roots of trust. In the end, politics is not rhetoric but process, and process creates trust only when it hardens into transparency, standards, and accountability. When process is opaque, suspicion remains even when outcomes are good, and when outcomes are bad, anger explodes. The Gabo reforms were the largest modern institutional reforms undertaken to innovate the accumulated structural ills of Joseon in 1894. The Gabo reforms are completed not by direction but by rules. They presented a direction toward modern state governance, attempting to correct contradictions in status order and in administration and public finance, and to redesign the state. Yet reforms are not completed by direction alone. The core lesson of the Gabo reforms is structural reform, not slogans. If the distribution of authority does not change, budget flows remain intact, personnel standards wobble, and auditing and disclosure stay weak, reforms remain on paper and return in reality. If rules do not solidify, entrenched interests find gaps and capture the people again. Global standards and world best practices share a simple conclusion. Decisions must be recorded, standards must be disclosed, and outcomes must carry responsibility. A learning structure must exist in which failure is not concealed, but connected to improvement. Only then does the resilience of national governance increase. In the end, the price of reliance on foreign powers exploded into the Sino-Japanese War. Amid the Donghak Revolution, the Joseon government failed to stabilize the situation through internal reform and chose to depend on external forces, changing the entire game. Around June 1894, Qing forces entered the Asan area in present-day South Chungcheong province, and around the same time, Japanese forces landed through Incheon, turning Joseon into a stage for international military competition. On July 23, 1894, an incident occurred in which Gyeongbokgung Palace in Seoul was seized by Japanese forces, further shaking domestic governance. The Sino-Japanese War was formally declared on August 1, 1894, and ended on April 17, 1895, with the Treaty of Shimonoseki. The war unfolded intensively on Joseon's territory and in surrounding waters. Fighting occurred around Pyongyang on September 15, 1894, and a naval battle followed around September 17th near the mouth of the Amnok, Yalu River. On November 21st, 1894, the area around Lushun on the Liaodong Peninsula fell, and from January to February 1895, battles continued around Weihaiwei on the Shandong Peninsula as the outcome solidified. This timeline is not an ornament of history, it is a root of national survival. The moment a country turns away from internal reform and leans on foreign forces, domestic conflict can transform into international war, and from that moment the state begins to lose its choices. The responsibility for ignoring the people's demands ultimately mutated into a terrifying war that threatened both the survival of the people and the sovereignty of the state. Self-interested collaborator politics among vested interests opened the final door to the loss of sovereignty. After the Sino-Japanese War, Joseon's sovereignty became even more fragile, and conditions strengthened in which foreign interests sat atop national governance. When external pressure grows while internal responsibility, design collapses, a nation fractures faster and recovers more slowly. Internal division makes external pressure more sophisticated, and external pressure enlarges internal evasion of responsibility, creating a vicious cycle. On August 29, 1910, the Japan-Korea annexation was proclaimed, making the loss of sovereignty a reality. This process combined not only external coercion, but also collaborator politics inside the country that promoted and justified annexation. The fact that forces existed that cooperated with annexation, including the traitor Lee Wan-yong, shows that when a nation collapses, the final door can be opened from within. When sovereignty is lost, citizens fall from being subjects of rights to objects of rule. Law and administration can easily mutate from mechanisms that protect the people into mechanisms that govern them, while citizens' lives see fewer choices and autonomy and more control and coercion. This ending proved how cruel the consequences were of ignoring Donghak's warning. The diagnosis of today's Republic of Korea can be summarized as declining trust and disappearing accountability. The danger signal today is not the number of incidents, but the speed at which trust is being worn away. In international comparisons, government trust is sometimes discussed at around the 30% range, and trust in political parties and the National Assembly is often assessed even lower. Reality is also discussed, in which corruption perception indicators remain around the 60-point range, an alarm that transparency and conflict of interest controls must become stronger. The economic structure is also directly tied to systemic stability. In a structure where household debt is often discussed at around 90% of GDP, household resilience weakens, and anxiety over livelihoods can easily spread into political polarization. A total fertility rate remaining in the 0-point range shakes the sustainability of national defense, welfare, regional economies, and education all at once. When the perception spreads that upward mobility is difficult, even with effort, marriage, childbirth, and challenge become discouraged, and as discouragement persists, growth and integration weaken together. The trajectory of late Joseon is not merely a story of the past. It is a reproducible path of operational failure. If the demands of ordinary people cannot be absorbed by institutions, the inside rots. If the inside rots, the nation becomes vulnerable to external shocks, and a weakened state is more easily shaken by division and helplessness. Defending democracy and the market economy begins not with blaming outsiders, but with establishing internal systems of trust and accountability. A strong prescription must be executed through a rule-based coalition that transcends factions. Decisions must be recorded with when, where, and on what grounds they were made, and disclosure must become the default. Without records, accountability disappears. Without disclosure, distrust surges. Disclosed records make power more careful, place citizens in the role of verifiers, and the more verification becomes possible, the more statecraft moves by evidence rather than emotion. Budgets and appointments must be obligated to disclose standards and procedures. Projects must have clear goals, metrics, and deadlines, and when performance is poor, redesign must begin automatically. Appointments must have clear job standards and verification procedures, and conflicts of interest must be blocked forcefully. Auditing must function not as showmanship, but as auditing that changes outcomes, and accountability must be executed in reality. This task must transcend faction. To transcend faction does not mean to blur responsibility. It means to establish rules in which anyone who errs is held accountable, and anyone who delivers results is evaluated accordingly. Trust cannot be restored through tribal fighting, and without trust no policy can endure. Honam's revolutionary spirit must become the standard that awakens the Republic of Korea. Honam's Donghak was not a flag to incite division. It was a flag of standards demanding an end to corruption and the establishment of fairness. Honam's revolutionary spirit must appear not as violence or hatred, but as a demand for honesty, responsibility, and fairness. When Honam leads in building a civic culture of verification, setting standards first, demanding the same yardstick for everyone, and refusing to bow to any power, the Republic of Korea will change its direction from division to integration. The call that Honam must rise again is not a slogan to help a particular faction. It is a request for Honam to demand first fair rule of law, transparent budgets, evidence-based appointments, and effective auditing, and to awaken the entire nation by those standards. Professor Nam-Yong Lee strongly urges that Honam's revolutionary spirit must ignite again as an asset that saves the nation. The conclusion is clear. When the demands of ordinary people are reflected in institutions, trust accumulates and the system strengthens. When those demands are ignored, distrust accumulates, the inside rots, vulnerability to external shocks increases, and the end leads to the fall of sovereignty and dignity through war and collapse. The vast granary land of Honam must rise and shake itself awake. Thank you for watching Professor Nam-Yong Lee's column, Long,